It's time to poke some sticks in the eye. Hello, and welcome to the sleepy but rotted review of The Eye, the original 2002 Hong Kong version directed by one of my favorite director pairings, the Pang brothers. And I have to apologize in advance. I might be a little blurry and low energy ish today, the sleepy part. I promised myself when I started this channel, I made a series of promises for myself that would be conveyed passively to you, the viewer. First of all, that I would be releasing 2 new videos every single day of one horror film, first being a spoiler-free review and the next being a spoiler-filled deep dive discussion. And ultimately what that means is between watching a movie and, committing myself to watching a horror film every day, because I really don't like doing a review without having seen the movie prior, at least 24 hours prior, or at most 24 hours prior. And the next being that I will not be watching or reviewing sequels before the originals or remakes before the originals. So that puts me square in the viewpoint of the original The Eye. This is not the Jessica Alba remake. This is not the Eye 2 or the Eye 3/10/Infinity. It's called all of those, which is one of my favorites, and I actually do want to get that review under my belt. But groundwork first, The Eye. And I saw this a while back, a long while back, and I couldn't trust my memory on it. Like I said, I don't like to let more than 24 hours go between watching a movie and doing a review. It's not to say I won't do it. I just don't like doing it. So I watched it yesterday, and I was asked to officiate a wedding. And so I watched this before the wedding, and now it is the next day at 5:30, and I am sleepy. But I made a promise. I'm going to keep it. I'm going to do a review. So let's just go ahead and start this by getting right into the scoring system. As always, 5 different categories, each category worth up to 20 points for a total possible score of 100 points. And the first category is the plot/subtext. And the plot of this one is fairly straightforward. A young woman who is now in her, early to mid-20s, and she's been blind since she was 2, gets a corneal transplant and is now able to see. But it's not like flipping on and off a light switch. It's blurry, she's very light sensitive, and more importantly, her visual vocabulary is very limited, pretty much non-existent. She can tell what something is by feeling it, but if you just hold this up to her, this channel not brought to you by Blistex, she would not be able to know what that is until she got her hands on it. And so she's working with a therapist to get that visual vocabulary up to speed and integrate her back into normal life, and teaching her to read, things like that. And of course, she starts seeing things that nobody else sees, things that are very creepy, and trying to figure out why and what those are. Overall, I thought that it was a fairly decent, consistent story that was well told in a coherent fashion, but it just wasn't. There were moments of it that just weren't very engaging, certain moments of it that just weren't terribly believable, plot points that I didn't think really needed to be there. And I think that the very ending, without spoiling anything, I think the very ending was somewhat unnecessary. It felt like we had resolved everything prior to that happening, and it felt like a bit like a hat on a hat kind of thing. So ultimately I gave this a 12 out of 20. Not bad, not great. Intent was to be a scary movie, not really deep on the religious Asian mythos kind of thing that a lot of Asian horror movies rely on. There is some element of that, but for the most part, it's kind of like a Twilight Zone what if situation. And I think that worked fairly well. It just there's a portion of it that I'm going to be touching on in the fear quotient, but really digging into in the deep dive spoiler filled discussion. There's really no way I can discuss it really in depth without spoiling things. So I'm not going to do it in this review. I'm going to touch on it in the fear quotient, but there is an element of this that I want to get to that is explaining why the intent didn't get as high of a score as it should have. And the only thing I'll say about it at this moment is that the intent of this was to be a scary movie. So 13 out of 20 for that. And the acting, I thought was one of the stronger parts of this, but here's my issue with it, is that the performances felt very stiff and very reserved. And I know that there's a portion of that is a very cultural thing. However, I'm not willing to give that a whole lot of forgiveness. I think the main character of Mund, played by Angelica Lee, she did a fairly decent job of this. But I have seen Asian movies before, horror and not, where the cultural aspect of that requires a certain level of propriety and a stout character in the face of anything that is thrown at them, but they still sell their performances, even if they have to do it in more subtle ways, through facial tics and through more smaller movements, and without going over the top and overacting and so forth, where that's not even a real possibility for the characters and the culture that they're existing. I've seen better performances in way more reserved ways, and I think one of the best examples of that I can give is A Tale of Two Sisters. So, on one hand, yeah, it was stiff acting. On the other hand, it is cultural. On the other hand, I've seen it done within the cultural context better. So I gave that a 12 out of 20. The technical portion of this, again, this is 2002 and it's limited budget. So what CG aspects they had in there was a little bit rough, but for the most part, they relied on camera tricks and tricks in the editing room, and I think that worked fairly well. The portions of it that they decided to make kind of first person in the eyes of Mun, I thought worked pretty well. The blurriness and the putting us in her shoes of not knowing what is actually there, not knowing what is what she's seeing versus what other people are seeing. Some portions of it, like an elevator scene where she's looking through, through the doors of an elevator, and also looking at the camera that is, the monitors up above, back down, and the discrepancy there, I thought was well done. There were technical aspects of this that I really liked, and I have to give it a 14 out of 20. I kind of was struggling with it. Should I give it 13? Should I give it 15? And ultimately, I just kind of landed in between. The fear quotient, again, I'm going to touch on this, but I really can't dig deep into it. And my attempt to do so is going to be phrased thusly. There is a big difference, and it is a very clear line. It is not ambiguous. It is a defined line, and I'm going to tell you what that line is in the deep dive discussion. But there is a defined line between creepy and scary. And this movie was trying to be a creepy, scary movie. It was trying to, it was ultimately trying to land on scary, but it relied on creepy throughout. And I don't think that creepy is scary, and I don't think that creepy can drive an entire movie. I think that it can have elements in there that ultimately work towards scary, but there's a line, and that line needs to be present, and it wasn't in this movie. So, without getting too far into it, because at that point I'll be just spoiling things and ruining the movie for anybody that wants to see it, and I'm not willing to do that here, I gave it a fear quotient of 8 out of 20. It definitely has some good creepy moments to it, but not enough to drive an entire movie. So that gives us a total score of 59 out of 100 points. What I will say about this is Would I recommend it? I would. And to anybody that has never seen Asian horror films and are interested in doing so, I think that this is actually a pretty darn good place to start. It has a solid narrative, a beginning, middle, and end, and it doesn't fall into the pitfall that a lot of Asian horror films do, where it gets lost in its own narrative and lost in its own mythos and dissects the technical aspects of the mythos, and looks at it at 100 different angles until you finally just get exhausted by it. This was just a solid mystery storytelling creepy movie. I just wouldn't expect it to really scare you a whole lot. It's going to have some moments of good creepy factor, a few little jump scares here and there. It's just not going to be the scariest thing you've ever seen. So that's about the best I can really say for it. And there we have it. That's the original Pang Brothers version of The Eye. So until tomorrow, next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.